Welcome. I'm Bill Hartung, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'm very happy to be here today to moderate this panel on an important new book, How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. If I had a copy of the book, this is the part where I hold it up, but you've seen it hopefully in the invitation, and you'll see it once you've bought it. So we're joined by the four co-authors of the book, Narges Bajoghli, Vali Nasr, Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, and Ali Vaez. And I'm going to briefly give bios, abbreviated because they've all done so much. And then I'll direct questions at each of the co-authors, and then we'll get into a longer conversation. So Narges Bajoghli is Assistant Professor, Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, award-winning anthropologist, scholar, and filmmaker. Her book, Iran Reframed: Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic, received the 2020 Margaret Mead Award, 2020 Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title, and the 2021 Silver Medal in Independent Publisher Book Awards. I didn't know you were allowed to get 3, but that's great. Vali Nasr is the Professor of International Affairs, Middle East Studies at Hopkins SAIS, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council from 2012 to 2019. He was the Dean of SAIS in 2009 to 2011, senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. He's authored numerous books. I'll just mention a couple of them here. The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy and Retreat, the Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future, and Democracy in Iran, History and the Quest for Liberty. Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, professor of economics at Virginia Tech, expert on the economics of the Middle East. He's also a research affiliate of the Middle East Initiative at Harvard's Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Ali Vaez is the International Crisis Group's Iran Project Director, Senior Advisor to the President. He led the Crisis Group's work on the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Previously, he served as Senior Political Affairs Officer at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and he was the Iran Project Director at the Federation of American Scientists. So folks have been busy. Just a few opening reflections, and then we'll get down to it. 4 decades of increasingly harsh sanctions on Iran have failed to achieve U.S. policy objectives. They have caused immense suffering to the Iranian people, in some ways may have even strengthened the regime. To me, the only way sanctions are relevant is if they're part of a diplomatic give and take. If you're going to use them in perpetuity, they serve no purpose. If it's part of negotiations where they'll be lifted, as part of changes in behavior, perhaps they have some value, but we'll discuss that. And one thing I hope we might get into, which is, a difficult question to fully answer, is, the Middle East is at war. And how did the sanctions on Iran and the tensions in the U.S.-Iranian relationship, is there a missed opportunity? If we had stayed in the Iran deal, if there had been a more normal relationship between the U.S. and Iran, would that have been helpful in this current crisis? Or is that, speculation that's not really possible to, concretize in a real judgment? So I think that's pretty much what I want to say. And start with Narges. What prompted you all to do the book, and what were some of the main things you found, and was anything, surprising from your research?
Yeah, thank you so much for leading this conversation, Bill. We started this project, or sort of the ideas and thinking around this project, in 2019. And it was under a larger umbrella of a research project called Iran Under Sanctions. And that was sort of the beginning attempts at starting to want to understand what was happening in Iran under sanctions, but particularly with the onset of maximum pressure sanctions in 2018. So over a dozen scholars from around the world were invited who have a long history of doing research in Iran and understanding Iranian society from a variety of perspectives and sort of disciplinary backgrounds. And all of those scholars helped contribute to show a more comprehensive view of what was going on in Iran under sanctions, from economists to environmental scholars of the environment, to social scientists and knowledge producers. And then from there, my co-authors and I not only were able to sort of see all of these connections across what was happening on the research, but we also began to understand and really talk more with one another about how there needed to be a more comprehensive narrative of what was going on in Iran under these many years of sanctions, and particularly maximum pressure. So what we did at that point was to come together and begin our own kinds of research and analysis. And we supplemented a lot of that beginning work with new economic research, with research especially on the societal front and in the political culture and political front. And what we found in our work and in our research is that sanctions have hardened the political culture of Iran. They have weakened, especially the middle classes, and made population as a whole poorer. And they have benefited certain sectors of society, which we'll get more into as our conversation goes on. And I think one of the most important things that we attempted to do in this book is that sanctions are very abstract, right? They're written by lawyers. They're discussed among legal minds and folks in the banking and finance world. And so they remain on a very abstract level. And what we wanted to do was to show the various implications and ramifications of sanctions on everyday lives, from those who are struggling to get by because they might be single mothers, to those who are thriving because their businesses are affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard. And this was, we wanted to bring sanctions down to a human level in this book, and then show you how those processes played out economically, historically, and geopolitically. So that's sort of the overall view of it.
Thank you. Now, speaking of geopolitics, Vali, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Iran's security strategy, their role in the region, and how has the sanctions regime affected that?
Well, Iran has pursued a strategy that is seen in the West as being confrontational and aggressive and expansionist vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis its neighbors. But at another level, it is a strategy that from a long time ago has been about breaking up containment of Iran, which was essentially set in place after the revolution. An aspect of that containment is also sanctions. And we can discuss that as we say in the book, that the longer that the sanctions have lasted, the more actually Iran has seen its presence in the region, being able to exercise force, being able to punch holes in the wall of containment as necessary, both to surviving sanctions, but also developing a leverage to negotiate with the United States. And in fact, you could look at the period of maximum pressure sanctions, that one of Iran's immediate responses to maximum pressure was actually to become far more aggressive in the region as a whole. And you know, to the point that you raised at the very beginning, that if sanctions are to be useful, they actually have to lead to negotiations. One of the things that we discuss in this book is that they can only be fruitful in negotiations if they actually can be removed. And this is actually, as we show in the book, is a theoretical concept that it's not practical. In other words, the United States says it will lift sanctions, but it's either unable to do so, or it can immediately return them, as we saw with President Trump. So the value of the case of Iran shows that even value of sanctions in bringing countries to the table has been drastically diminishing, and that gives Iran a further incentive not only to pursue its nuclear program, but also to pursue an aggressive policy in the region, because ultimately it's finding itself under permanent sanctions. So it has an overall strategy about how to survive and to push back against what it sees as a situation that's not, there's no easy path to get out of.
Thank you. So Djavad, could you go a little deeper into the economic effects of 4 decades of sanctions and why they didn't work?
That's a very good question. At one level, the impact of sanctions involves simple math. Iran in 2011 was earning about over $100 billion in oil revenues. And with sanctions, if you look at the last decade, on average, Iran lost 1 million barrels of oil per day, which costed about 28 billion per year. So that kind of simple math, I think, misled a lot of people who are very optimistic about sanctions to think that the economy was going to quickly collapse. 2/3 of the foreign exchange was coming from oil. More than half of the government revenue was coming from oil. So they saw a lot of disruptions. Now, at the next level, what does this loss of revenue do to the economy actually gets more complicated. It goes from math to economics. And we do careful work using a lot of interesting data from Iran. What's really interesting about Iran and people don't know is that it has tons of data. 40 surveys, expenditure surveys, 24 labor force surveys. So we marshal a lot of evidence to show how the loss of revenue had impacted ordinary people's lives and so on. And from there on, it gets even more complicated and outside my area of expertise, which is how does loss of living standards of the people affect their political behavior? What would they do to put pressure on the government as the sanctioning authorities had hoped would then lead to change of behavior and policy? I think at the first level, which what I call the simple math, it worked very well. Oil income dropped. Iran was under a lot of economic pressure. On the second level, which is how does it affect the economy, when you look at the economics, Iran did relatively well. So this is one of the reasons why I think you see economic resilience. Again, unlike what people think, a lot of people think Iran's economy has a fair share of markets, or markets play a fairly large role. The exchange rate was allowed to devalue. When the exchange rate devalues, prices change. Price of imports go up. People buy fewer imports, and some other exports increase. So there's economic adjustment that takes place because the government allowed market prices to change in response to the sanctions. There was some movement in terms of employment. Employment increased after the sanctions because more domestic goods were being produced. Iranians stopped going to Turkey, for example, for vacations. They were touring Iran's attractions. So you see some of those positive effects that have helped Iran resist the sanctions. At the third level, which is what do people do when their incomes have dropped? We show that 9 million people left the rank of middle class, joined the lower middle class or the poor. The ranks of the poor expanded. So there was all that. But Iran has a very, I would say by standards of third world countries, effective social protection. Since 2011, it has had cash transfers where people get money in their bank accounts the moment government deposits it. Even today, even though inflation has ate into those cash transfers, is about $1 a day for people, for about more than half the population. The part that is really weak in Iran in terms of social protection is protecting the middle class from falling to poverty. And that has been, I would say, the ambiguous effect of sanctions. If they wanted to weaken the Iranian middle class, they succeeded. If they wanted to get the middle class to become more active, Iranian middle class has been for last 30 years a moderating role on Iran's politics, both domestic and external, then in that sense, they failed. I think you have a weaker middle class is unable to challenge the government in elections, which are coming up in 2 weeks and so on.
Thank you. I have a question for Ali, which I couldn't be concise, so it's a little longer, but I'm interested in the political implications of sanctions policy inside the United States. It seems like there's a faction in Washington that wants to keep sanctions forever, even though, as you document in the book, they're counterproductive. Is it possible to get an effective political force in the U.S. for lifting sanctions and making them a less frequent tool of U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you very much, Bill. It's great to do this with my fellow co-authors. Look, I think sanctions are often the path of least resistance when it gets to U.S. foreign policy, especially dealing with difficult adversaries, because they have tremendous appeal to hardliners who see them as a way of crippling a regime that they don't like and punishing it. And they're also appealing to more moderates in the U.S. political system because they see it as an alternative to war. The problem is that, as they say, sanctions are easy to impose, more difficult to enforce, and even harder to remove. And so, and we have to understand why that is. I think there are both technical reasons in the US and political reasons. Technically, we often pile on different measures, not in different legislation, but more or less in the same legislation. Even if there are follow-up legislations, they amend the previous legislation. So it's very hard to come up with clear lines that distinguish between different measures in pursuit of different objectives. For instance, in the European Union, you have standalone legislation that targets Iran for its non-proliferation related activities. There are sanctions that target Iran for its support for terrorism. There are sanctions that target Iran for human rights violations. And these are separate legislation and have different conditions for removal, different timelines as well. And that gives the negotiators more ease to try to remove them if there are indeed acceptable behavior changes. Whereas in the US system, because there is no clear line dividing these different objectives, these means over time, I think, morph into ends in and of themselves. And that creates the second problem, which is a political problem, that basically any kind of use of sanctions for advancing diplomacy where you need a scalpel and not a chainsaw becomes politically very toxic for the administration that is in charge. Because basically the US is making concessions short of a wholesale change in the behavior of that regime, which often amounts to regime change, right? So we saw this with the Obama administration, for instance. They offered Iran sanctions relief mostly because Iran did what the US wanted, which was to roll back its nuclear program and put it in a box and under the most rigorous monitoring mechanism out there. But that wasn't good enough because Iran was still engaged in its regional activities and human rights violations. And we don't have a mechanism that would give the president any power beyond suspending for a short period of time sanctions, even if the target country has done exactly what the US wanted, which in the case of JCPOA indeed happened and was verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this, in some ways, I think, makes sanctions worse than war, because I think there are three main distinctions here. One is that in wars, as we see now with what's happening in Gaza, you see the atrocities. They're visible. You can see them on your screens, and you see the human suffering. With sanctions, it's not as visible, it's not as tangible. And so it doesn't create the kind of bottom-up pressure that we see, for instance, now in the US, huge segments of society asking for a ceasefire in Gaza. You don't see that in countries that are targeted by sanctions. Also, as I said, the other difference with wars is that the president can decide when there will be ceasefire or an end to a conflict, even though it's Congress that authorizes war, but the decision to end it is the president's alone. In this case, in the case of economic warfare, the president cannot do that on his own, and he needs to negotiate. And of course, in a situation that you have a very polarized political space in Washington, and even more polarized on a subject as radioactive as Iran, it becomes very difficult to offer sanctions relief without moving the goalposts all the time. And the last difference, I think, is wars are often followed by reconstructions, and in some cases, even the U.S. is in the lead, like after the Second World War. Whereas in the case of sanctions, despite the devastating economic impact that is inflicted on the target country, we don't even feel the need that we need to be engaged in one way or another for reconstruction post-sanctions relief.
Thanks. Yeah, that was very comprehensive. I know, well, first, I'm glad that the term economic warfare is in the title, because as you indicated, some people view sanctions as kind of like the soft alternative to war. They don't realize that sanctions can kill, and they can have devastating effects that last for years. But in a context where too often the media and others, if there's a crisis, they want the United States to do something. And by doing something, they mean use force. I think even some liberals view sanctions as kind of like a safer alternative. So I think the more people realize that it's warfare by other means and ineffective and to boot, the more likely we can shift policy on this. So for anybody in the panel or all of the panel, do you think Iran is a unique case? Cuba's been under sanctions even longer than Iran. I think some people thought that sanctions on Russia would change its behavior with respect to Ukraine, which it has not. In the book or in your thoughts on this, do you see any common threads among the different sanctions that have been imposed?
I can start us on that. So just as we began the Iran Under Sanctions project at Johns Hopkins, and Ali helped lead it in its first year and sort of helped germinate the whole thing. From there has spawned other research projects, which are looking at now sanctions across different, or the impacts of sanctions across different societies, and also different kinds of sanctions, so targeted sanctions as opposed to comprehensive sanctions, things like that. So what we're seeing in this research project that we're also leading here at SAIS is that, yes, actually there are many patterns of similarity as far as the ways in which sanctions work and the impacts that they have on societies. So one of the things that, my co-authors and I, when we were discussing and brainstorming this book, part of the thing we realized is that people oftentimes ask the wrong question. The question is not, do sanctions work? Of course, sanctions work, right? When a country with the economic size of the United States is sanctioning a country, whether Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or Zimbabwe or South Sudan, they work. But how do they work? And what do they end up doing in society? And the ripple effects of that, some of it obviously is very dependent upon so Iran is very different than Cuba for lots of different reasons. So then you will have a much greater crisis of food security in a place like Cuba than you will in a place like Iran, right? So it's not like everything ends up being the same when a country is sanctioned, but overall patterns of what happens in society and political culture, we are seeing deep similarities between them, which is helping those of us who are working on this across different spaces and researching this begin to really pinpoint the ways in which sanctions are actually causing similar things. So what are they? The things that we're seeing quite a bit of is, again, the hardening of the political and military establishments within sanctioned countries, because, as my co-author said, sanctions are warfare for two main discursive reasons, let alone the ripple effects that we see. And what do I mean by that? Because first of all, the targeted society and their ruling establishment sees sanctions as warfare, as cutting off and suffocating sort of trade lines, and therefore reacts in that way, but also because sanctions architects in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere, when they write about sanctions and what they do, they use the language and the metaphors of warfare, right? So both from a sanctioneering perspective, as well as from a receiving sort of targeted perspective, this is seen as warfare. So the hardening of the political and military class is to be expected, and it is what we're seeing across all different cases and countries. Number two is that obviously the push into very difficult economic circumstances up until dire, depending again on the socioeconomic class one is beginning in, and the makeup of the country that's being sanctioned. And we are seeing, for example, in Cuba and Venezuela, that it has resulted in massive migrant flows. I mean, for the first time, we're beginning to hear in Congress representatives talking about the need for sanctions reform because it is leading to migration crises on the border from Venezuela and from Cuba, and that's because of the squeezing of it. So these are some of the main broad things we're seeing. And then sanctions are supposed to do two things, right? They're supposed to either force enough change on the sanctioned country in order to force behavioral changes in the state, or it's supposed to put enough pressure on the people to rise up against the system of power and force change or bring them down completely. Those are the two main goals of sanctions. And we see, for example, in Cuba, in 2021, when people did rise up because of very difficult harsh sanctions from the United States coupled with COVID has created a really difficult economic situation. That was met with severe repression and with a complete police state response, similar to what we've seen in Iran when there have been uprisings in the past many years because of the very difficult situations and the further disgruntlement with the system of power. Again, completely met with a very brutal response. So as the system is hardening, it is also waging war itself on its population, especially whenever they rise up. These are, again, things that we see across the board in all of these spaces.
That's great. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that?
If I may also add, I think one of the things that is really critical for us to understand is that in the US, there is really very little attention paid among the key policymakers, and especially at the Treasury Department, to the impact of sanctions. It might sound shocking, but in the 20 years that between 2001 and 2021, that the US increased the use of sanctions by 900%, according to an internal study that the Treasury Department conducted when President Biden came to office. There has been only in May of 2023 an attempt by the Treasury Department to hire an economist to look at the impact of sanctions, economic impact of sanctions, which is the most obvious impact that one is looking for. And it's really shocking that it took this many years and with such overuse of this tool to finally get to a stage that we start more seriously and scientifically looking at the economic impact of sanctions. But as Narges said, the impacts go way beyond that, intended and unintended. And I think without understanding, for instance, the environmental implications of sanctions in a country like Iran that could affect the entire neighborhood, not just the Iranian people, it's really essential to try to understand other aspects of sanctions, and then to adjust sanctions policy based on that, not just on the amount of harm that it inflicts on the target country, but on whether it's actually bringing us also any closer to the strategic objectives that we had in mind. And the second point I want to make is that, which I think slightly distinguishes the case of Iran with Cuba, although the Obama administration also tried sanctions relief with Cuba. But what was offered to Iran in the nuclear deal was one of the most comprehensive sanctions relief that the US has ever put on the table. And the lesson of that experience is that the US is unable to offer effective and sustainable sanctions relief. And both of those qualifiers are important because even the Treasury Department could not, in a timely fashion, issue the licenses that US policymakers had promised to their Iranian counterparts, for instance, on access to civil aviation technology and parts, because every single part needed to have a separate license, and it took months and months for the Obama administration to be able to deliver. Same thing with chilling impact of sanctions on banking transactions, that they couldn't even, with the Secretary of State going around the world begging literally banks to resume transactions with Iran, it still didn't work. And sustainable, of course, it wasn't, because the Trump administration came to office with the promise of withdrawing from the JCPOA and snapping back the sanctions. And that, to other countries that are subject of US sanctions, like North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, are going to, I think, is going to have significant implications in terms of whether the US is able to effectively use this tool in future advancements of its diplomacy or not.
Let me just add a few points to Ali's excellent points, which we detected with Iran, and then we can extrapolate to apply to elsewhere. One is that in the case of Iran, America's strategic objectives are not clear. It definitely is not clear to Iranians. So is the purpose of sanctions to punish, to bring behavior change or force them to the table, or is it regime change? And in fact, if you looked at even the President Trump's maximum pressure, at that point, his idea was that Iranians will come back to the table for a much bigger deal, better deal. Whereas Secretary Pompeo's conditionalities that were attached really pointed to regime change. So and that really applies across the board. In other words, the purpose of what we want to get from sanctions itself is not clear. Secondly, there is and Ali, who writes a lot about the most of the sort of the way in which sanctions was implemented, and it's very clear in the narrative, is that the way in which the Treasury goes about making sanctions is and the way it enforces them, and even in the case of Iran, the way they interpreted sanctions removal is not coordinated and with what are America's foreign policy objectives. In other words, even when they could lift sanctions after JCPOA, when the Secretary of State at that time, John Kerry, was promising that sanctions relief would bring business to Iran, the way the OFAC office, which issues licenses, went about implementing sanctions relief, even when it implemented sanctions relief, was not in coordination with the State Department. I'll give you an example. A major accounting firm situated in the Middle East wanted to start doing business in Iran or find out what kind of business its clients could do in Iran. And technically, it could engage with Iran according to the lifting of sanctions under JCPOA, except the Treasury gave an opinion that for every single phone call, for every single trip to Iran, for every single engagement with Iran, the firm had to apply for a separate license. And then each license would obviously take up to 6 months to process. So the Treasury had no intention to lift sanctions. And that's also true of all the other countries, as if the Treasury has basically become a sanctions producing and sanctions implementing machine, now divorced of American foreign policy objectives. And the third point of commonality, and Narges can say more about this, is that imposing sanctions on countries goes with a process of vilifying them, turning them into pariahs, right? In other words, they become an evil that then a US president or some members of the Congress cannot touch it at all. So so it's not like shooting bullets, as Ali said, at an enemy where you could just stop doing it. When you characterize Iran or Cuba or Venezuela as satanic, as horrible, as evil governments, then it makes it almost impossible to say, well, how are you going to give them money? And that's the way it's put. It's not that you're lifting sanctions on them. It's that you're now handing money to them. And that process of the sort of image building around sanctions is something we haven't really thought about, but it's common across all of the countries that get sanctioned.
If I may also add something on the
Yes.
economic, you asked a very good question, Bill, about are there differences between these countries or the patterns? One of the interesting things about the economics as effects of sanctions that economies differ in subtle ways. Even Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, who are oil exporters are easy to sanction because it's much easier to track ships that carry oil, that carry transistors or smart TVs. One of the things that has been perplexing, and Ali mentioned that, about not having expertise at the Treasury about Iran's economy. By the way, Richard Nephew, who was one of the architects of the sanctions under Obama, he writes in his book that you must have good information about the economy. Now, they have, after 10 years, appointed a couple of economists, but I don't know them. And I study Iran. So when you study developing countries, if you look around, even reporters become specialized in a country and they know each other. I don't know how you can find just a couple of economists and say, hey, go study Iran and become expert on Iran. It takes years to become expert on a country. Venezuela differed in very subtle ways from Iran. For example, their leaders had such a strong socialist rhetoric that was anti-market. The Iranian clergy has never had that. There are some people in Iran who have a very strong anti-capitalist, anti-market rhetoric. But in general, they respect private property. They listen to economists who say the market mechanism is what you need. Russia is another case. Its energy exports were very difficult to restrict because the European market heavily depended on Russian Russian gas exports. So if you thought that ruble, the Russian currency, was going to collapse just like the Iranian currency collapsed, you would be wrong. You'd have to have experts who understand Russia, who have studied Russia for years, Iran and Venezuela. So it's very hard to get lessons from Iran that say, okay, now we know how economies respond. This is not like bombing a city. It doesn't matter you're bombing Baghdad or Tripoli. Buildings collapse just the same. In economics, there are very subtle differences, and that's why there's a whole field of development economics, people that specialize in areas, South Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and so on.
Thank you. Well, I had a statement and a question. I didn't hold up the book, but if you look at Ali's background, you can see it very well. I'm sure it's there all the time. It wasn't just done for this purpose. But in terms of questions, what about the political impact? I mean, if you have a regime that's not particularly delivering very well in terms of services or input to government or accountability, but they're under immense pressure from sanctions from a larger country, can they use that as, this is the source of your problems, it's not us? Does it have a political effect in strengthening some of these governments?
So that goes, in the Iranian case, it's been a little bit more complicated than some of the other cases that we've been mentioning in the conversation. Because in the Iranian case, because of the different kinds of fractionalisms, and because of the fact that it was those on the more reform end of the spectrum who kept making the argument and sort of attempting to create the political space, that engagement with the West, and we, in order to get sanctions relief, we need to engage with the West. Because of that, the more sort of political conservative and hardline elements within Iran began to blame them for the impacts of sanctions. And then instead of what you see, for example, in some of these other sanction societies that we've talked about, like in Cuba, the line always is, we are under this economic distress because of the United States blockade. That is a part of the revolutionary rhetoric of Cuba. That's not part of the revolutionary rhetoric of Iran. And so what that's meant is it has led to a complete domination from the hardline political end of the Iranian spectrum, in addition to, because sanctions, and especially maximum pressure sanctions, are a shadow war, meaning that it is not just economic sanctions. It's not just that the economy is being forced under heavy strain, but also there is cyber warfare happening back and forth. There is media ops going back and forth, psyops. And all of these things that are happening mean that the shadow wars are intelligence wars, first and foremost. So then therefore, the strategic calculation from a targeted society under maximum pressure sanctions is that it is the intel outlook, and in Iran specifically, that tied to the Revolutionary Guard and their extraterritorial Quds forces. So their strategic outlook under maximum pressure becomes the strategic outlook of the Islamic Republic pretty much dominantly. Like, they dominated under maximum pressure, whereas before, those on the other end of the political spectrum had created space in order to advance the argument of engagement for sanctions. What this did, and what we sort of see span out in this time period, is that discursively, the entire space, in addition to actually materially, like those who were on the end of the argument for engagement now have been marginalized, and in that space has grown a politically hardened outlook, which then therefore, this is why we're also seeing what we're seeing as far as the regional conflict, regional heating up of what's going on, is because, again, it is tied to that kind of what is called the battlefield mentality within Iran and within sort of the larger things that are going on in the region at this moment. And that is tied into ideas that discursively within this sphere of hardliners in Iran and the IRGC in particular is talked about as resistance to, and then this is then where we have ideas like resistance economy. We have ideas like what is going on in the region with axis of resistance, right? This is all coming from the same discursive field that we see becoming more and more dominant with maximum pressure.
Thank you. Do any other panelists want to weigh in on this? All right, I've used the 5-second rule, so it will go. There's a fair number of questions from the audience. First one is, does the extensive use of financial sanctions by the U.S. lead nations to look for alternatives to U.S. dollars for trade? What effect does this have on U.S. power?
I can say a few words. I'm not really an expert on international economics, but I read a lot. There are a lot of people who are afraid that this will happen. It's very natural for countries to look for other ways to trade. Iran has reached out to China. It has devised systems of barter that look very much like international trade. So Iran accumulates yuans in China, and then it can only buy stuff from China. So that's a limiting thing. You can't use the yuans to go buy stuff from Malaysia. But slowly, the global economy is trying to come to terms with this overuse of sanctions from Washington. And I think they'll find ways, it's not rocket science, that other currencies become valuable. All you need is a stable government with a good economy to say, if you take this currency, you can use it to buy other things from other countries. So I think the trajectory is not difficult to project, that if this wide-scale use of sanctions continues, that the countries that are being sanctioned or are under threat of sanctions, now some large countries are China, Russia, they will find ways to trade with each other without the US dollar.
Thank you.
I would just add to that sort of setting the replacement of the dollar as a goal might be a stretch, but if we look at the case of Iran, once a definite outcome, as Djavad said, is that the longer the sanctions stay, the more the countries, and in this case Iran, finds ways to actually go around sanctions, invest in technologies, trades, etc., that allow sanction busting, which means that the effect of sanctions then become less and less. So in other words, if you want to compel them to do something, if you leave the sanctions long term, they learn to live with it and they can survive under it, and then they're not as compelled by sanctions. Secondly, if you sanction too many countries, like now Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, you create an ecosystem which actually allows them to have this sanctions busting even more prolifically. And then basically your sanctions become less effective. So it's not just about whether the dollar would be replaced, is that sanctions would actually lose its ability to either change regimes or change behavior.
Thank you. There's a question for Vali Nasr in particular. If sanctions on Iran fail to achieve the goal of changing Iran's regional behavior, as appears to be the case, how might it impact the great power competition between the United States and China?
Well, the United States has failed to change Iran's behavior, whether it's on the nuclear issue or on the regional issue, because it's actually not able to lift sanctions. I mean, if right now America's only way of trying to manage Iran's involvement in the region, in the Gaza war, is to bomb Iraq or bomb Houthis, that doesn't go very far and also puts the United States at risk of having to get involved in a war that it does not want. But if it actually were to ask Iranians, what do you want? And more than likely, Iranians would want, in addition to ceasefire in Gaza, they want sanctions relief. And the United States is not able to give that. Or that its promise of that it would give that is not credible. In other words, if the US's reaction to everything immediately is sanctions or re-sanctioning, then ultimately it has no influence on what Iran does, short of actually going to war with Iran, which is more of a deterrence to the United States right now than it's a deterrence to Iran.
Thank you. So there's a question about the relationship between the war in Gaza and U.S. approach to Iran. It says, do you think the war in Gaza has played a role in U.S. strategy towards Iran and prevented them from going back to the negotiation table?
Maybe I could take that. Well, it clearly has, because we had a period of de-escalation between Iran and the US last year. In fact, last year around this time, Iran and the US were engaged in quiet diplomacy aimed at facilitating a prisoner swap and also de-escalating tensions, which came to fruition last summer with the detainee deal, which came along with a humanitarian understanding as well, that resulted in the release of Iran's frozen assets in South Korea to be used for humanitarian trade. And then also we saw the longest period of quiet in the region, where there were no attacks on US forces in Iraq and Syria between March of 2023 and October 7th. And indeed, the US and Iran were supposed to go back to the negotiating table on October 18 in Oman to try to discuss the future of nuclear diplomacy. But then October 7th happened, and the door was completely shut on any prospect of engagement, certainly not before November of this year, after the presidential elections. But also this bill in and of itself created another, I think, problem for the use of US's financial muscle, in the sense that the Biden administration didn't officially, but de facto, restricted the assets that it had released had moved from South Korea to Doha to be used for humanitarian trade. And remember that humanitarian trade is exempt from US sanctions according to existing laws. So all the Biden administration was doing was conforming implemented US policy to existing US laws. Nevertheless, because Iran is a supporter of Hamas and because of the political backlash that that deal had produced, the Biden administration de facto restricted Iran's access to those assets. The problem with the precedent it sets is that this is not the Trump administration reneging on the commitments of its predecessor. This is the Biden administration reneging on its own commitments for something that had nothing to do with what happened in Gaza. This was a detainee deal, a humanitarian deal, had no conditions attached to Iran's regional policy. And it's yet another reminder to the Iranians that effective and sustainable sanctions relief that we talked about is not on the cards. And here you end up with two mindsets that are just irreconcilable. One is the mindset of the right wing in the US, which basically boils down to Iranian enrichment is more dangerous than uranium enrichment. So anything that would be beneficial to an odious regime is not good, short of course, toppling that regime. And the mirror image of it on the Iranian side is that the only thing that is more dangerous than suffering from sanctions is surrendering to them, because then you would teach to the US that this powerful tool in its hands works, and if it works in one case, it will be a slippery slope that would only end in a complete overhaul of the system, in other words, regime change. And this creates a zero-sum situation in which, again, sanctions are not able to advance diplomatic negotiations at all. And let me add also one point on the China dimension here, which is very important because as we get closer to the elections, you would hear this argument that the only reason maximum pressure didn't work was that it wasn't maximum enough. And that the Trump administration would then have to come in if it gets a second chance with an ultimate pressure policy, as if adding to the sanctions would eventually work. But the reality is that now we're in a world that Russia and China are no longer on board with isolating Iran and putting pressure on Iran. And they are able to provide Iran with a kind of lifeline that was unimaginable in the Obama administration when the JCPOA was being negotiated. And China was actually enforcing US sanctions against Iran. So now we are in a situation that we can probably never again reach the degree of leverage sanctions-wise that the US had in the Obama years that led to the JCPOA, whereas Iran's nuclear program is more advanced than ever and closer to the verge of weaponization than ever. And so they have much more leverage. And with that asymmetry, it's hard to imagine that one could produce a deal that is more sellable in Washington than the JCPOA was.
Thanks. Related to Gaza, a lot of the attacks on U.S. troops are really in response to United States support for Israel's war in Gaza. The U.S. is now retaliating. Hawks are saying, go to the source, attack Iran, both in Washington and Israel. Do you think there's a circumstance under which Biden would give in to that and actually do airstrikes or other military action against Iran, or would he hold out against that?
I mean, yes, there are circumstances. Let's say if there's mass casualty events involving American troops, then the president could not attack Iran directly, particularly if intelligence shows that the direction came from Iran or the missiles were fired from Iran. But short of that, once you go down the path of military confrontation with Iran, you cannot assume when you stop. And a lot of these arguments are based on assumptions that go back in the 1980s when the Reagan administration attacked Iran's Revolutionary Guards Navy and put it out of commission. Iran's military capabilities are now far more advanced than they were then. And it has shown willingness to use them. I mean, when when the United States killed the Revolutionary Guard commander, General Soleimani, many of the same hawks in Washington said, okay, now we have restored deterrence against Iran. But then the Iranians attacked a base which housed American troops with the largest barrage of missiles in American military history. And it was lucky that Americans were not killed. That does not suggest to you that the Iranians were coward and went back into their hole because of the killing of Soleimani. In fact, it was President Trump that decided not to pursue the matter and just said, a few people have got headaches and they can take aspirin, and did not want to make anything of Iran's missile attack. So the Iranian view was actually they restored deterrence also against the US. So you're dealing with a government which is quite opaque to us. Its decision-making is opaque to us. It sees itself as cornered. It doesn't see a pathway that it can engage the United States and sanctions would be lifted. If you attack it now, you have to assume that it's going to accept defeat, that it's going to go in its hole and not do anything about it. But what if it does? What if it retaliates? What if it miscalculates and escalates against the United States? And then we're on a path to war with Iran, which could be quite complicated. So I think the dilemma that we find ourselves in, and that's not in any way excusing what Iran is doing, is that we now have only one option with Iran, as the hawks say, which is to escalate, either go to ultimum maximum pressure, as Ali says, or attack them militarily, because we no longer can offer any carrots in any negotiations to them that is credible to them or that we actually can implement. And that's basically the tragedy of sanctions, is locking the United States into military confrontations that it doesn't want.
Thank you. So we're down to 4 minutes. It's kind of like on one of those game shows where we have a lightning round, but not everybody has to win. But if any of the panelists have sort of a final word or so, we should do that now. Well, if not,
may I suggest there was a question on corruption, which I think is good if Djavad answers, and there was a question on the impact of sanctions on women that I would love to hear Narges' thoughts on.
Thanks.
I just wrote a couple of short sentences in response to those because I thought there might not be time. But corruption and sanctions go together naturally. Economic activities go under the radar from U.S. Treasury. They also go under the radar in part from Iranian government. So it's natural for corruption to increase. We have had actual instances of multi-billion-dollar corruptions in sale of oil, in import of tea, that are closely connected to sanctions, and in large part to the multiple exchange rate system or dual exchange rate system that Iran had to adopt as a result of sanctions. I don't think you can answer this part, but the questioner had asked, could you quantify? It's very hard to quantify. In fact, the whole book, we are careful to say it's not easy to attribute a particular outcome to sanctions because multiple things are happening. For example, right after sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions, COVID hit Iran. So you have to be very careful to distinguish that. And that's the question. Maybe that's the kind of answer I would give to the women's employment. Women employment went up after Trump's departure for the same reasons I mentioned, because the economy becomes more inward oriented. But then COVID hit and women's employment was hurt seriously.
Narges, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah. What I would say just to follow up with what Djavad just said, I mean, women are among the most impacted by economic sanctions, mostly because they have not only just, their food baskets are shrinking over time, and they are usually the ones in charge of providing for the families and making sure that children and others, have what they need for schooling, for food, but also for questions of social reproduction more broadly. And so I would encourage anyone who's really interested in those questions in depth to look on the Iran under sanctions, because we have a bunch of scholars who've looked at that question very much in detail, including Nazanin Shahrokni. But the other thing that I would say that's really important here is that women are also at the forefront, and this is what we highlighted quite a bit in the narrative of the book, that women are in the forefront of creating mutual aid networks to help offset the impact of sanctions. And this is incredibly important for what's going on and sort of what that means as in mid to long term. And then the other thing, and this dovetails off of what Djavad said, is that women are also at the forefront of creating a lot of the micro businesses that have sprung up in reactions to sanctions. So as things become harder to get, especially certain kinds of imports, women have had a chance to create their own micro businesses, whether it come, for a variety of things. And so that is also providing different sources of income and different sources of I don't even want to use the word entrepreneurship, but different sources of creating new social realities in Iran that did not exist prior to that. So again, part of what we're trying to do in this book is showing the various ways in which sanctions end up having repercussions in society, and among the most impacted are women. And that's one of the reasons they're at the forefront of the narrative of the book too.
Thank you. I want to thank the co-authors, thank the Rethink Iran Project, thank everybody from SAIS who helped make this happen. A small commercial that'll help all of us is Quincy's doing an event tomorrow about the book, and there's enough there that you'll learn things that you didn't learn in an hour today. So feel free to join us among the others that will be coming. And I think there's a lot to discuss here that is going to go well beyond a couple of webinars. So I thank you again for doing the book.
Thank you.